Welcome, everyone. We have a short welcome video for you. Welcome to the survey results webinar for the metro areas of San Diego, Washington, D.C., and Milwaukee. I'm Carissa Tastian, Director of Programs at Digitunity, and I'm joined by some of my Digitunity colleagues on today's webinar. Digitunity's mission is to eliminate the technology gap with and through a network of stakeholders and solutions so that everyone can thrive in a digitally connected society. We're an independent, national scale, nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing digital equity through device ownership. We're glad to have all of you from these metro areas and guests with us today. In the next hour, we'll be hearing from Dr. Amanda Beacom, Vice President of Research and Data Science at Visible Network Labs. Over the last several months, Digitunity has worked with Dr. Beacom and her team to design and deploy a survey in 10 metro areas that are part of our pilot program to address the homework gap and specifically building sustainable device ecosystems. As believers in taking a collective approach to digital equity, we undertook this effort to gain insight into what organizations in these metro areas are engaged or want to be engaged in digital equity efforts, and to better understand organizations' interactions, quality of interactions, power, trust, and value that all make collaboration work. Our goal is to offer a tool for insight that will complement your other efforts and hopefully provide knowledge and connections that lead to benefits for community members. After this webinar, if you participated in the survey, you'll receive an organizational profile for your own organization and a highlights report of your metro area. After Dr. Beacom has provided an overview of the results of the survey, we will provide time for your questions to be answered. Please use the Q&A section rather than the chat, but the Q&A section to pose your questions. I'll then close our time together describing some next steps. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Beacom.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Carissa. Thanks to the rest of the Digitunity team. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, and thanks so much for joining us. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I have some fun results to share via slides. And as Carissa mentioned, if you participated in the survey, many of these results, as well as additional information, is included in a report that will be distributed to you. Just to start us off, let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm from Visible Network Labs, as Carissa mentioned, and together with my colleague, Kaylee Baczynski, it's really been just our pleasure to work with Digitunity on this project. Visible Network Labs is a social enterprise. We're a small organization based in Denver, Colorado. We really work to help people and organizations and communities use network science, which we'll be talking about more in this presentation, to increase their capacity to really achieve their goals around social change and making a positive difference in the world. Um, we do that by providing technology, software tools, training, and data analytics. And that's what we've been doing for the past few months with Digitunity. Let's just dive right into the results of the surveys in DC, San Diego, and Milwaukee. Um, as those of you who participated in the surveys may know, we launched data collection via an online survey instrument in May of 2022. And this was distributed both through organizations and contacts that Digitunity had previously partnered with or knew of, but also through social media and other publicity efforts. So you may have received a personalized invite to participate in the survey, or other respondents may have heard about the survey through publicity and engaged in it that way. We had a couple of really key objectives or questions that we used to guide us throughout this project. And one was just really to try to map the ecosystem of stakeholders in each of these cities that are engaged in advancing digital equity. We wanted to better understand those ecosystems, how different members of those ecosystems work together, how are they currently collaborating, and then also really understand in terms of their digital equity work, what is their current assessment of that work that's going on in their cities, and what do they really want to prioritize for the future with regard to that work. So with those objectives in mind, let me now move on and share, again, just some highlights from the results in each of these three cities. We'll start first with giving an overview of the ecosystem in DC, San Diego, and Milwaukee. One of the things that we asked all survey respondents was to tell us a little bit about the populations that they serve and try to reach. And what we saw from the results of this question across all the surveys is that digital equity organizations and other stakeholders who are working on digital equity efforts are really trying to reach a broad range of populations. And so what this chart is showing is for DC, the populations that are trying to be reached and targeted. Purple, or you might see it as dark brown on your screen, bars at the top are those populations that the greatest majority of respondents identified as trying to serve. And then the rest of the green bars are additional populations covered by those respondents in DC. So we see in DC that the top populations are low-income people, people of color, and women. But again, I want to emphasize that you see a lot of other populations also being addressed in the DC area. And similarly in San Diego, we have a number of populations being served. in the ecosystem. So top populations in San Diego were again low-income people and people of color and women, but also people with disabilities and the general adult population. And then in Milwaukee, we see that top populations being served were the overall general public, teens, young adults, and adults, and then also older adults and incarcerated folks or formerly incarcerated people. And then finally, as was the case in San Diego and DC, low income people. But for me, the takeaway that I had from this information about populations served is that in general, all of these ecosystems are really trying to reach a broad swath of people in their communities. We also asked respondents to tell us a little bit about the resources that they felt they are able to contribute to the ecosystem of stakeholders working to advance digital equity. And so in DC, the most common resource contributions listed by survey respondents were technology distribution, so distributing devices or access to the internet, workforce development, digital skill support, and community engagement. And we see in San Diego that similarly, there was also the identification and listing of community support or community engagement, workforce development, and digital skill support, like in DC, but then also San Diego mentioned digital navigation as another top resource that they could contribute to the community. And finally, in Milwaukee, we saw that all of the respondents to the Milwaukee survey felt that they could contribute community engagement resources, and then coalition building, digital skill support, public awareness and or media campaigns, and then technology distribution. So you see that there are a lot of similarities in terms of the resources contained within these three ecosystems, but also some unique assets. And I should also mention that here, these were just the top resources that each city respondent, set of city respondents listed. So it's not a comprehensive list, there were others. And obviously, as with any of these survey results, we're limited by the folks who did respond. So of course, there may be other organizations that are contributing other resources in these cities that just didn't respond to the survey or aren't reflected in our particular results. Let's take a look now at how these organizations and stakeholders for digital equity reported that they currently work together. And so what I'd like to show first is what we call network maps that represent these ecosystems. And what I'm showing you is a slide that shows the maps for San Diego, Milwaukee, and Washington, DC. You'll see that each of these maps looks quite different. Let me just give you a little orientation to what you're looking at here. So when we create network maps, we represent organizations or the people within them as circles, or those colored dots that you're seeing. on the slide. And then we represent the relationships between those organizations as lines. And so the maps are a set of circles and lines. And then we color code those circles, in this case, by the type of organization um, uh, that responded or is being reflected in that map. And so the color coding here is that yellow represents nonprofit organizations, blue represents public agencies, and orange represent private organizations. Um, and so you'll see immediately, and I'm sure you're noticing that all of these network maps in each of the three cities are quite different. And so let me talk a little bit about those differences. I do want to say again, as I mentioned with the earlier data, of course, these network maps are only as accurate as the folks who responded and the respondents that we received. So one of the things that you may be doing when you're looking at this is thinking about how accurate do I actually think these network maps are. Are they really representing what I know about my own ecosystem and my own community? And I'd love to hear some of those reactions either now or later in the presentation. But they may not be obviously totally accurate just because, of course, not every single participant in the ecosystem responded to the survey. So it's not going to be an exact representation of what's going on in your community. However, even when we have a pretty small number of responses, it still can tell us a little bit about the community and what's going on in that ecosystem. So let me talk a little bit more now about what I'm seeing in each of these three network maps. I'm speaking as an outsider and not an expert in digital equity and the work that happens around digital equity in each of these cities. And so as I'm giving my impressions, please keep in mind that I'm just speaking as someone who has expertise in network and ecosystem mapping, but that each of you, with your knowledge of these communities, can bring your own expertise and really valuable interpretations to these maps. So in the DC map, one of the things that I think is interesting about DC is you see that all of the organizations represented here are connected to one another. And so that's telling me that of the organizations and the folks who responded to the survey, it's a pretty cohesive ecosystem. Everyone here is connected to one another, either directly or indirectly. And indirectly means, sort of, they may be partners of partners, right? Sort of that concept of 6 degrees of separation. So that's one thing that's notable here, is that there is a lot of cohesiveness in the ecosystem. Another thing that I think is notable is you do have a mix of both public and non-profit organizations. You do have a couple of private organizations as well. One of the things that I always look for as an outside expert is, are there some key actors that are connecting the map together, connecting sort of potentially disparate groups or cliques or subsets of the network. And here in DC, we're definitely seeing that. So, um, for example, this organization right here that I have my cursor on is connected to both this cluster of organizations and also this cluster of organizations and this subgroup here. And so this organization maybe play a critical role in the network because they're connecting groups that might otherwise not be connected. And in network science terms, we call that type of actor in an ecosystem or a network a bridge or a boundary spanner. Um, and so they, if they left the network or no longer were involved, you might see more disconnection between these organizations. So those are some things that I take away from the DC ecosystem. In Milwaukee, we had a smaller number of responses, and you immediately see that in terms of just there's fewer organizations and relationships represented between them. So if we had more respondents, for example, in Milwaukee, the map in Milwaukee might look more like Washington, D.C. We don't know. And some of you may be able to fill in some of that contextual information just based on your on the ground knowledge of what goes on in Milwaukee. But one thing that I note just from this representation of the ecosystem is first of all that there are only nonprofit organizations represented, so just the yellow circles here. And so if any of you from Milwaukee who are in attendance on this webinar, you may think to yourselves, is that really accurate or not? Are there mostly nonprofit organizations in our ecosystem? Or actually, is there a more diverse set of organizations participating? The other thing that I'm noticing here is that there are obviously sort of these two groups that aren't connected to one another. And so again, I would want to, if I was talking more with representatives from this ecosystem, I would want to know, is that actually the case, or is that an artifact of just potentially maybe a key organization didn't respond and there actually are connections between these two groups. And then finally, the San Diego ecosystem definitely looks different than these other two. One of the things that happened in the San Diego survey is that we had one organization that really took the time to record many of their partners and gave a very, very comprehensive listing of all of the organizations that they work with. And that's the respondent that did that is represented by this little circle here. And you can see all of these lines then fanning out from that one organization, representing all of the partners that they identified. You'll also see, though, that there were a number of other respondents who also recorded who they were working with in the ecosystem. Overall, you'll see there are definitely interconnections between everyone in the ecosystem here. There's a range of different types of organizations. So there is some private company representation here in San Diego, but there's also a lot of public agencies and nonprofits. So diversity in terms of the different types of organizations. So definitely just a range of different looking ecosystems if you look at these network maps. Um, and then what I'd love to do is then share with all of you what some other community networks look like that our company, Visible Network Labs, has worked with in the past. And all three of these networks represented by the mappings here, they are all different from the ecosystems in San Diego, Milwaukee, and DC, in that they're all really formal networks, meaning they have a formal membership list. They have formal meetings where they meet regularly. And they would all, if you asked all of these members of these ecosystems, they would say, yes, I am a member of blah, blah network. And so that's probably a little bit different than was the case in the ecosystems that we mapped in the three cities we're presenting on here. And what you see with these more formal networks is a very common sort of structure that we often see with formal community networks that I call and it is known in network science as a core periphery structure, where you have sort of a central core of very active participants. And so you see that by sort of all of these lines in the center of these networks. And then we have a periphery of less active, potentially less well connected members sort of on the outside of these maps. You don't see that so much here in the digital equity ecosystems that we mapped. Again, probably because these are less formally established networks, and because what we were really just trying to do is map the ecosystems of all stakeholders engaged in digital equity, rather than mapping these really formal systems. However, I wanted to show this to all of you because if the ecosystems in any of these three cities became more formal and really organized into regular meetings and really formal structure, this is what you might end up seeing over time. One final thing I want to add here is when we look at this sort of very typical structure where there's this more active core and less connected periphery, um, those people or organizations in the core and in the periphery, in both of those positions, are really playing equally important roles in the overall ecosystem that's at work. So the folks at the core are, of course, they're the organizers. They may be part of organizations whose mission is really directly related to the network. And that's why they're more active in it. The folks that are more on the periphery and less well connected, and you can see some of that in the DC network. You have some folks that are a little bit more on the periphery. Those organizations maybe not as, for example, engaged, and they may not be exclusively focused on digital equity, for example, but they're still nevertheless really important stakeholders and may provide access to resources or community members or voices that are really important for the network to consider and understand. In most networks and ecosystems, you have organizations that are in that core, really active group, and then are more on the periphery. And both types of members of an ecosystem are important. I noticed that we got a couple of questions in the Q&A. And so I'm just going to take a look here at what's being asked. So one of the questions was, with such a strong presence in the San Diego ecosystem, why is device distribution not listed as a priority resource? And I have to say, I'm not sure. These were just the results that we got in from the respondents that did answer the survey. So it may be that, again, that the sampling of folks who did respond to the survey may not have reflected what you see in your from your vantage point in the ecosystem. So it's definitely important to keep in mind that things that may not ring true to you may not ring true simply because of the subset of organizations that ended up responding to the survey. And let me see if there's anything else here. Oh, okay, great, device provider. Yeah, I'm not sure. The nonprofit who had all of those connections, and let me just go back to the map so we can all refresh our memory in what we're looking at. So this organization that did report all of those connections, they only submitted one survey, and so if they were the device provider and engaged in device distribution, they would have just said once that they were engaged in device distribution, and potentially the other respondents did not select that as a resource that they could contribute. So that might explain what you're noticing in the results. I hope that addresses your questions, and definitely if you want to talk more, let's do so at the end of the presentation. So let me move on now, because while network maps and these maps that I've been sharing with you all are a nice visual representation of what may be going on in these ecosystems, we also collected a lot of other data to try to get a more rich and full picture of what's happening in ecosystems. So one of the other things that we asked about was around to what degree and how are you collaborating with the partners who you identified working with? And we wanted to really understand, are you just aware of this partner and maybe you understand their mission and what they do, but you don't really work with them closely on programming? Or are you working, maybe exchanging information with them at a cooperative level, at a coordinated level? Are you potentially synchronizing your activities with your partners? And then at this, what we call an integrated level, do you actually have a formal agreement or relationship with some of your partners to do the work that you're doing together? And we like to ask this question to really understand sort of the intensity with which people are working together in the ecosystem. And here in DC, so in the survey, we asked people, can you characterize the collaborative intensity with which you work with each of your partners? And so we see in DC that really there's a range of collaborative intensities across all of the relationships reported in the network. Um, we had 36% of those relationships that might be only at the awareness level. And then you had about 50% that were at these sort of middle levels, and 14% at the highly integrated, highly collaborative level. And this is actually what's represented here in DC is a really healthy distribution of collaboration. What we always look for when we're looking at these results as, again, outside network science experts, is we don't want to see, for example, 50% of relationships at the awareness level only, because then that means that folks aren't really leveraging the collaborative advantage to the full extent that they could. But also, we don't want to see maybe like 75% of the relationships at the integrated level, because that's sort of a red flag to us that partners in this ecosystem may be working together really intensively, and their level of collaboration, while maybe very productive, initially might not be sustainable over the long term, because people get burnt out, collaborating that much with one another. We know that from our own experiences, right? So this is what we're seeing in DC, but let's take a look at what's going on in the other cities. So we can take a look at, let's see, San Diego. So definitely a different distribution here, a little bit more of relationships operating at that integrated level, and a little bit of a different distribution at these middle levels. And then in Milwaukee, we had a number of relationships being reported at the integrated level, and at the coordinated level. Remember, though, in Milwaukee overall, we just had 6 responses. So it's probably, well, it might be a sampling of what's going on in the ecosystem. It might not be totally representative of all the relationships there. So we looked at collaborative intensity. We also measured the trust and value that collaborative partners feel for one another. And of course, we all know that trust is really important in strong collaborative relationships. We measure trust on a 3 dimensions. So we measure it in terms of reliability, in terms of whether or not partners feel they're supporting a similar mission, and then how partners rate one another in terms of their openness to discussion. And then we have an overall trust score that you see reflected here. Similarly, we like to look at how partners value one another, because we know that in ecosystems and coalitions and networks, different members bring different forms of value to the collaborative effort. Some organizations bring power and influence. They may be funders, or they may have regulatory authority that they can exercise that makes them powerful or influential. We have some partners and organizations in an ecosystem that may be highly involved and engaged in the work of that ecosystem. And then other partners may be able to contribute a lot of resources or really critical resources to that particular ecosystem. And so we asked these questions, again, of all respondents in each of the 3 cities. We see in Washington, D.C., so I should say that These were on all of these scores are on a 4-point scale where 1 is low and 4 is high. So you see immediately that all of these scores are relatively high. So, if you're scoring at 3 or above, we really consider that to be a high score. And you'll see in DC, all of these scores are relatively high, but there's some variation in terms of how people rated each dimension that we were looking at. And then there's also some variation between trust and value. In general, across all of the network evaluation that we do at Visible Network Labs, we tend to see that the trust scores are a little bit higher than the value scores. So what we see here in Washington, D.C. is pretty typical of what we see across many networks and ecosystems. And then here, one thing I'll just note, so the trust scores are really pretty uniform across all the dimensions. The value scores have a little bit more variation. In DC, people felt like their partners were particularly strong in terms of, and valuable in terms of research contribution, and slightly less so in power and influence, but not significantly. If we take a look at the other cities, we'll see some differences. So again, in San Diego, we had a high trust score. Particularly, people thought that their partners were very reliable. We had a slightly lower value score. And here in San Diego, in contrast to DC, people had higher power and influence scores and slightly lower resource contribution scores. So that might mean in San Diego, there were more organizations that again had that funding or regulatory authority that often tends to make partners more powerful or influential. And so that might be how I interpret that. And then finally in Milwaukee, the scores were very high. It was a smaller network. And people really had a lot of trust for one another, which is easier, of course, when you have a smaller network. And then the value scores were also a little bit higher than in the other cities. That may be because, again, in a smaller network, it's just easier to understand and be familiar with on a more intimate level with what each of your partners brings to the table. But the reason that we ask these trust and value questions is first of all, to give ecosystems sort of an understanding of overall what might be their strengths and weaknesses. And then in the individual reporting that we provide to each survey respondent, we also break these scores down into individual scores, if available, for each of the respondents, so they can take a look at how their partners anonymously report feeling about them, and really look at and evaluate some of their strengths and potential weaknesses in their collaborative work. I want to move now on to the information that we collected in these surveys around what the community is doing, what they feel are their current successes, and what their priorities are for the future. And so what we asked respondents to tell us is, looking at a number of different potential digital equity objectives, which are represented here on the left in text, how successful they felt their community was on these different objectives. And we asked people to rate the objectives from very successful, which is represented in these bar charts, with the dark blue, and also with the green or teal color, to neither successful or not successful. So sort of a ambivalent rating that people could use. And then the orange and the purple colors are somewhat or very unsuccessful. And then we also gave folks an option to say they weren't really sure. And so here, what we've done for the first set of ratings, the DC ratings, is just put a bar to separate those, whoops, let me go back, those objectives that respondents, 50% or more of respondents considered to be very successful or somewhat successful. And for DC, those were identifying populations that were experiencing digital inequity, increasing access to devices and the internet, engaging government in digital equity efforts, committing to long-term solutions instead of those sort of short-term Band-Aid fixes, and increasing public awareness of issues related to digital equity. So really 5 objectives where at least half of the respondents felt that their community was somewhat successful in achieving. If you go ahead and look then and compare that to San Diego, respondents also felt that their community was relatively successful in a number of objectives. Here, San Diego really highlighted success in terms of collaboration among leaders and organizations, again, increasing access to devices and the internet, increasing capacity of organizations that are doing this work, increasing public awareness, identifying populations that are experiencing digital inequity, engaging government again, committing to those long-term solutions that we know are really important, and then also measuring and sharing progress. And finally, in Milwaukee, there were 4 objectives that respondents rated as being successful so far. And those were, again, identifying the populations that should be focused on, engagement of philanthropy in digital equity efforts, increasing public awareness, and addressing digital equity through policy. So across these 3 cities, you see some commonalities and also some differences in terms of what they thought they had been doing successfully and not so successfully. We also asked then respondents to tell us going forward what they thought should be the top priorities in advancing digital equity. In DC, respondents' top priorities were increasing access to devices. So even though folks thought that they were pretty successful in doing that work, they thought they should still really be prioritizing that going forward. They thought that they should really be working to engage residents who are directly impacted by this issue, and then increasing the capacity of organizations that are working in this area. In terms of San Diego, they answered that question by identifying increasing access to devices, committing to long-term solutions, and increasing the capacity of organizations. And then finally, in Milwaukee, the top 2 priorities were increasing access and increasing capacity of organizations. So here in these forward-looking priorities that respondents articulated, you see a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity in terms of what different communities felt like they should be focusing on moving forward. Finally, I just want to leave you all with some general recommendations for what to think about when looking more closely at these results or digesting them. Um, if you are a member of one of these communities, I always like to really emphasize just the value in doing some sense making around these results and deciding whether you think that they are an accurate representation of your ecosystem, or if there are things that um, you think are not accurate, or maybe some additional contextual factors that you would want to add to the story that these results are telling. So you can think about how the members of the ecosystem are connecting with one another based on what the data say, and what it really seems most valuable in collaboration in this particular ecosystem. You can think about what sectors or types of organizations were represented in these network maps, and if there's over or under representations, basically sort of thinking about that question of is everyone at the table who should be at the table? And again, is this network map an accurate representation of who's at the table currently? And then also thinking about, sort of looking ahead and thinking more evaluatively, are there things that these results tell me about my ecosystem? They may not be perfect results and they may not be totally representative of what's going on, but are they informative? Nonetheless, are there again, sort of gaps that we can identify in these ecosystems that might, if they were filled, help us really achieve those priorities that our community identified? Are there tweaks that we should make in terms of how we're collaborating based on the data that we have about our collaborative intensity or the trust and value that were reported? So that's some ways to think about these results. I want to emphasize again that, at Visible Network Labs, we are very much outsiders to what is actually going on and all of the exciting things that are happening in each of these ecosystems. So it's important for each of you to fill in your own knowledge about these communities, in addition to the results that we presented here. I'll go ahead and stop and take a look and see if I can identify or answer any additional questions here.
Yeah, Dr.
Um,
Beacom, I can jump
yeah.
in for you to make it easy. Or there's a great question in there about, is there an aggregate view of some of the priorities or data sets across all the cities? And I know we've talked about that. Is that something you'd be covering in the general or more public webinar tomorrow? Or how would you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we can cover tomorrow. I can say right now, I think there was a lot of diversity in terms of how both the three communities that we're presenting on today, but also all 10 cities that we surveyed. There's a lot of diversity in how respondents answered that question around what their ecosystems were doing most successfully. And so I think from sort of that aggregate level perspective, one of the things that's valuable about the fact that there's diversity is you can, as like let's say I'm a member of the ecosystem in San Diego, if I feel that my ecosystem is not doing a good job on one of the digital equity outcomes that we measured, chances are there's another city or community that said that they were actually doing pretty well on that particular outcome, that I might be able to connect with some organizations in that particular city to ask them, why they think they've been more successful, what have been some keys they felt like to really achieving some success. And so that's one way that you might be able to use that aggregate data. But in general, there's just a lot of diversity there in terms of what the different ecosystems thought they were doing better and not so great at. I think there was a lot more consensus around what everyone in all 10 cities thought that they should really be prioritizing. A few differences, but I think the priorities that were reflected in the three cities that we talked about today are ones that everyone sort of in all 10 cities that we looked at were really valuing. So I think there's a lot of consensus, across the 10 cities in terms of what should be a focus moving forward.
And then James, we'll have to shortly wrap it up, but James had a question which kind of segues very well. Is anyone tracking digital access for persons with disabilities? Many web resources are not accessible to blind or deaf persons, excluding them from access to governmental services, commerce, education, and other important services. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on the people with disabilities portion of the survey, and then I will finish up, James, with some invitations to continue the conversation and learn from others, and that may be one of the areas we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that in the data that I showed at the very beginning of the presentation, we asked the questions around populations that the different organizations who responded were serving. And we did ask about people with disabilities. So just really quickly, let's take a look at that. So in DC, 58% of our respondents said that they were trying to serve that population. In San Diego, actually 80% said that they were trying to serve that population. And then in Milwaukee, also 80%. So just from this snapshot of three cities, it sounds like there are a number of organizations trying to do that work. And definitely, I think if you wanted to reach out and connect with Digitunity, we could get you more specific results about which organizations in your community or the communities that you're interested in are actually doing that work.
Thank you, Dr. Beacom. I think that's all the questions and time we have for today. I have a few slides just to finish this out. I really like to thank Dr. Beacom. I could listen to you all day. I've told you that before. I learned so much and so empowered by the information you share with us in such an interesting way, fresh way, I would say, for our field. And I also like to thank all of our participants today for several reasons, for stepping up into this journey with Digitunity as we are learning ourselves about a new way and hopefully a very productive way of looking at our work, but also for all of you who completed a survey. We fully recognize the time and labor that you gave to us, and we really are making it a practice to give back the data to you directly and as a real as a real thank you. So be on the lookout. If you've completed the survey this summer, you will be getting, as we said, a highlights report and a member profile. There'll also be a portion of our website where we'll have information, anonymized, but some information about the maps and the VNL work on our websites. That's forthcoming. We're also would like to continue the conversation in the new year through a series of regional meetings, and we're not, saying which areas and which ones we want to focus, but I think it, building off what we've learned from Dr. Beacom today, how can we take what we've saw and the priorities we've saw today and, help guide what our work is ahead in each community. And we want to just provide the space and information to help amplify what you're already doing and exchange and best practices where possible. Um, we don't have a plan in place for a formal network or anything like that, but if that is what folks want to have, we're very much in support of that. So on our next slide, and you'll be receiving this in follow-up emails as well, are the dates for those follow-up meetings. We mixed up the cities a little bit to do a little better with time zones. I think over time, these may become a more, maybe 4 regions across the United States, but this is our starting point. So we would love if you could join us. We also have 3 more remaining webinars if this has piqued your interest. We have one tomorrow that is for pretty much general public focused. It'll talk about, all of VNL's work and, pinpoint certain communities, but it's not just focused on 1 or 2 or 3 cities. And then the following week, we have on November 10th, 2 remaining webinars with the other cities. So we really appreciate your time today. And we, more than anything, thank you, Visible Network Labs, and we value all of your partnerships. So thanks for joining us today.